Good morning, everybody. My name is David Downs. I am the CEO of the New Zealand Story Group, and welcome to many of you to this call. It's great to have such a great interest in this particular topic, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. I thought I'd start us off with a bit of a karakia, as is traditional, to start a meeting. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki tara, kia mā taratara ki tai, he aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihe mauri ora. That's a traditional start to a meeting, and I'd love to welcome you all here. We've got hundreds of people who've registered for this who watch it live, and then we've got many hundreds we know interested in global perceptions, and we'll watch this later. So let's start off maybe by just asking you all who's on the line. Like if you're watching this on the stream, tell us where you're calling in from. Maybe where are you about? We're in the world or in New Zealand. Put it in the chat and we'll be able to see it pop up in real time and know that there are people out there. Hi, Cleve. Nice to see you here. If others want to put something in the chat, we'll show it as well. So today's discussion is all around the global perceptions of New Zealand. We've got people here from Argentina. Good to see you, Gustavo. We have colleagues here from South Africa. My gosh. Auckland, of course. Tamaki Makaurau, quite a few, including Pukekohe, Te Puna in the Bay of Plenty. Gosh, I can hardly keep up. Martinborough. We've got Carrie from Dunedin. Kia ora, welcome. Lots and lots of people joining, and really good for us to be able to share the insights that we've gleaned over the last little while for all of you. So as mentioned, my name's David. I'm the CEO of the New Zealand Story. I thought we'd kick off just a little bit telling about what we do, and then as New Zealand Story, and then we will get into the meat of the presentation, and I'll introduce my colleague right now, actually, Alex Jones from One Picture. Kia ora, Alex. Alex is going to take us through the core of the presentation material, which One Picture has helped us to deliver. And then we've also got two special guests. We've got Jane Liu and Halon Smith, both from NZTE, who are part of the sort of trade relationships part of government. And I wanted to show those because, get these people on board because we'll have, I'm sure, a few questions. So part of the reason we're getting you all to input where you're from at the moment, and welcome to you from Whakatū, is to get used to this whole chat thing and how this functionality works, because we'll use this in the comments to ask questions later. So I'm going to say, kia ora, Halon. How are you this morning?
Kia ora, Dave.
Where are you calling from?
I'm calling in from Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, very exotic. And Jane, where are you from? Calling in from?
Kia ora, I'm calling from Auckland.
Very good. Excellent. And Alex, I know that you are from Taupo at the moment, I believe.
Yes, that's why I'm in a lovely Lockwood home.
Very nice.
But yeah, dialing in.
Very good. Well, I'm going to remove those guests for now and basically share some slides with you all about what we're talking about this morning. So today's topics are really around market and sector perceptions of New Zealand. And this is important for us because we know that over the last few years, the global perceptions of New Zealand have definitely changed and modified. And it's important for us to keep an eye on what the rest of the world knows about us, thinks about us, believes about us and themselves. So today on the call, we'll talk about consumer insights. There's a lot of insights that come understanding what individual consumers know about the brand of New Zealand and the value of New Zealand. And then we'll get into more business oriented. So for many of you who are selling B2B or focused on export growth to business, that'll be important. And then to the extent we've got some time, we'll go into some sector views. Now, we won't be able to cover the entirety of this research report today. It's quite a substantial report, but as usual, it will go onto the New Zealand Story Toolkit, and you can download and get the full report from there as well. So again, if you've got questions, I'd encourage you to put in the questions on the way through, and we can pop them up like this. Hello to colleagues there in Bangkok, Thailand. Sawadee kap, sabai mai kap. And we will able to, interact with both Alex, but also Halon and Jane as well. So let me kick off by talking a little bit about the New Zealand Story and who we are as an organisation, just to frame up why we care about global perceptions of New Zealand. First of all, we're a government agency or a government entity. We have 7 other government entities who help fund us, and we work with all of these agencies here. You can see Trade and Enterprise, Tourism, MPI, etc. We work with all of them to grow the brand of New Zealand globally. And we know that the brand of New Zealand is one of our biggest assets. Recently, a report showed us that it's worth about $440 billion US. So being from New Zealand really matters when you're going international. And our job as New Zealand Story is to enhance and grow that brand and make sure that the world knows the totality of us. For those of you who joined earlier, you were seeing a little video showing some of the kind of misconceptions of New Zealand. And, a big part of what we try and do is get the world to understand that there is a wider picture to New Zealand and that we do a lot of things. And we focus also on the values of New Zealand, who we are as a country, who do we stand for? And in a previous one of these calls, I took everyone through the sort of logic behind this. But essentially, this is the brand architecture for New Zealand, that we believe that this is a country where care for people and connection to place drives our ingenuity. And underneath that are these 4 values, which we express in Te Reo Māori, beautiful language, our language, pōtikitanga, the spirit of innovation, the kind of curious ingenuity, manaki, the idea of caring for others and being a good host, tiaki, the care for the land and the environment, and pono, this concept of trust, which is one of New Zealand's greatest assets, is the fact that we're seen as a very trustworthy country. So the brand of New Zealand stands for all of this. And when you sell from New Zealand, when you recruit people to come to New Zealand, be they visitors or students or whatever it might be, this brand value kind of enhances the value that you bring as an organization. As New Zealand Story, we offer a number of things. We have a toolkit, an online toolkit, and this is where the research report will live. And we also have a lot of imagery and beautiful pictures like this one. And we have content that we create regularly, things like social media content and others. The research reports, for example, the ones we show today, but also deep dives into particular markets. We do some work in a consultancy type of fashion, particularly with major events. And we look after the Fernmark program, which I'll tell you about later on, this trademark fern for New Zealand. But with that, I wanted to hand over to Alex. So the point that we're all here for is to hear from Alex and basically talk about the global perceptions of New Zealand. So Alex is part of an organization, which is one of our partners, called One Picture, a global research organization. And over the last few months, Alex has had the joy of going out there and understanding what the world thinks of us. Alex.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, David. Kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Alex Jones, and I am a strategy director at One Picture. What I'm going to be taking you through today is our 3rd global pulse check. So we did one of these in 2020, one in 2021, and now one in 2022. And what these global pulse checks are here to do is to really understand the perceptions of New Zealand in a world learning to live with COVID-19. So COVID-19 was still part of the conversation when we were going through these different focus groups, but it almost serves as, this work almost serves as a barometer to see exactly what has COVID-19 changed about our perceptions on the world stage, but also what's remained and what can we start to think about as we move forward into this sort of new future. For this piece of work, we had 4 different focus areas. The first one was to assess what had changed with our key partner markets in a world facing new challenges beyond COVID-19. Secondly was to understand the perceptions of New Zealand in priority markets and how they've shifted. Thirdly was to explore the impacts by sector and all the different lead messages we need to tell to maintain desirability in each one of our different markets, as well as for number 4, really identifying what those market nuances were to understand what we need to dial up versus dial down in a post-pandemic world. So broadly, now that borders are open again, what does that actually mean for us and for our sectors? For this piece of work, we completed 11 online consumer focus groups, 10 business interviews in 9 different markets. That was Australia, the UK, USA, China, Germany, Japan, Canada, Singapore, and Dubai. So for all the consumers that we spoke with, they were all active considerers of New Zealand goods and services. So whether that's travel, education, food and beverage, investment, a long list there, not just exclusively those. And for the businesses we spoke with, they all had a very direct line with New Zealand and New Zealand businesses. They were either selling or retailing or dealing with a New Zealand business in some way, shape or form. Like I said, this is the third year that we've run this now. So if you are interested in seeing what we heard in 2021 and 2020, feel free to go into the New Zealand Story Toolkit and have a look to see what we found. We've also got a little bit, because this is the third time that we've done this work, we have looked back slightly to see what some of the changes may have been across those 3 years and what we now need to be looking forward to. I like to start these pieces of work off with an understanding or a pause on why perceptions matter. And we've got 3 points here. So the first of which is that perceptions are part of our soft power as a nation on the world stage, and that's our ability to influence decisions without using force, which is really important. Secondly, is the fact that perceptions help exporters like yourselves start on the right foot in a new market or readjust in an existing market. So key to success is about knowing that market context and realizing the different opportunities that these perceptions present. Thirdly and finally, perceptions also help us see ourselves from a new perspective. So there might be strengths or vulnerabilities that we might not have seen before through the eyes of the global consumer. For this piece of work particularly, I'm going to be going in twos. So after two of the different sections that you see here, we're going to do a Q&A, and we'll stop and bring everyone back on the screen. So as I'm going through, feel free to throw questions into the chat, and they'll be collected up for us to go through at each of these different breakpoints as we go through. Before I get deep into the insights, this last piece is just a bit of a recap as to when I talk about 2020 and 2021 and the pack coming up. These were at a point in time. So in 2020, we were almost in this global spotlight as a country with a COVID-19 that many were envious of, but we'd also just cleared COVID-19 cases to zero. In 2021, we'd saw this deepening interest of who we are, how we work together, how the world respected our discipline and care, but we'd just gone into the snap lockdown after a single case of Delta. And in 2022, when restrictions are lifted and borders have reopened, let's start to see how this story is changing. We start off these focus groups really trying to understand the consumers that we're speaking with, how their lives are going, what they're focused on, what they're doing, to try to get an emotional baseline for how things are going with the global consumer right now. Doing this work across these 3 years has given us a really unique perspective around this shifting global COVID-19 narrative in particular. So in 2020, if you can all remember that, it was almost this reset moment where we were forced to sacrifice, but it was almost this time of reconsidering and also a time of hope for other changes that need to happen in the world. So when we were thinking about climate change and inequality, many consumers we were speaking with thought that, well, if the world has tackled COVID-19 in this really decided way, then maybe we can tackle some of these other challenges. So it was almost like this catalyst for rethinking how we wanted to live. Whilst we're a bit unsettled, we're isolated, we're also feeling the sense of empathy and sacrifice for those around us. Then we transitioned into 2021, where there was almost this sense of optimism, there was hope, life was returning back to normal, but there was less interest in sacrificing what they were sort of opening up again, and what that might mean for them. So really grounded in the sense of hopefulness. What was working really well for consumers at that point was how quick their nation was to start to achieve vaccination goals and to get open again. So they were really focused on direction, protection, and freedom in those groups in 2021. So in 2022, what did we find? Generally, there was the sense of people acclimatizing back into what they were calling a strange normal, as they're starting to look back out to the world again. So the fear from COVID-19 had been mostly left behind, and the sentiment that we had this time was that people were moving on, but quite cautiously. So cautious really was emblematic of what that emotional baseline was in 2022. There was an acceptance that COVID-19 was here to stay, but it was more endemic than pandemic. But there was starting to be this future focus, albeit in an uncertain way. So whilst the fears of COVID-19 are starting to fall behind, we've got these now new widening world pressures that are starting to come to the fore. So inflation hitting their back pockets, war on their doorstep, or climate events feeling closer and more intense than they have been before. So when you put all these things together, we've actually got a global consumer who is more self-focused than ever compared to the beginning of the pandemic particularly. So winning their attention when everything going on around them is quite uncertain needs to really anchor back to why they'll be better off as they go through this process, rather than it needs to have a what's in it for them, essentially. And so while the world has moved on, the pain hasn't been forgotten as we go through this process. So there is still an amount of stress from the last 3 years and what's happened, whether that be someone who'd suffered personally or they'd lost a loved one or they'd lost something financially. There was a sense that people hadn't come out unscathed. And then secondly, they were really grieving for what they missed out on. So especially the young people that we spoke with felt like there was a sense of lost time that they could never get back, especially those sort of just starting out on a university or something similar. So when they start to think about this pain, that pain can quickly turn into blame for what what they have missed out on. So anyone who's offering hope or getting back to normal or sort of showing a path forward, we're starting to win their attention as we go through into this sort of future-focused mindset. So when we did start to talk about COVID-19, when people from countries who have moved on started to hear about countries still working with controls or restrictions, it really started to trigger this negative response that they saw within them. So when it came to masks, for most of the world, being mask-free was this evidence that you'd gotten back to normal and you were moving on. But those who were in countries where masks were still mandatory, it was the sense that they were protecting those around them, especially their old ones. Secondly, most of the world is seeing continued lockdowns as the sense that it's a country chasing the unachievable, and you might be in a country that has less freedom than you might hope. And then thirdly was the sense of closed borders. So open borders mean open for tourism, migration, and business. But sort of like lockdowns, if your border status isn't necessarily open or the economy is moving again, it's showing that you're not necessarily valuing reconnecting to the world. So consumers, or what we hear from consumers, is this real desire to return to what was, coming full circle back to some of the normality of COVID-19. So if you're presenting any of these, they do start to question whether you are on that journey with them. So generally, from understanding where the consumers are at and their emotional baseline, what we heard is the implication for exporters is that we need to be messaging back to normal. So there's a global consumer that's looking for confidence, as well as a global business community that's looking for confidence, and we need to show that by showing that we've moved on, that travel, life, and business is back to how it was pre-pandemic, and that we are ready for the future. As we go through this as well, we get consumers to talk about their country and how they're feeling within it, and also how they're seeing their country act with those around them and the rest of the world. So we like to get them to understand what those global shifts might look like, whether that's perceptions of themselves or perceptions of us. So when we're getting consumers to define where they see their countries sit, the lead narrative that we heard in 2022 was around country momentum. So that was their country momentum specifically when it came to how much influence they had in the world or how much influence they believed they had in the world, whether that was soft or hard power. Secondly was the sense of connection, whether it was internally within those in their own country or externally to the world. And then thirdly, the sense of aspiration. So the degree at which they feel looked up to or whether they're making a change in a way that's positive or current in their area. So we found in this post-pandemic world, momentum really indicated the extent to which citizens were either leaning into their own country or looking out to others. So how we've pulled this together is that we found consumers in their own country perceive themselves as either strong, fair, or weak on each one of these different indicators. And I won't go through all of this because there is a lot of content in here. And if one of these markets is something that you're interested in, please feel free to download the pack at the end of the presentation, because we also do a 2-page deep dive on each one of these markets as well. So those coming through most strongly, the sense that they'd overcome COVID-19, the likes of Dubai and Singapore, the sense that they'd confidently worked their way through the pandemic and were now back open again and working really well. Some of the big changes that we saw this year was strengthening in the confidence of the UK and the USA. Both felt like they had the sense of momentum back. The likes of the UK, you can see how quickly some of these perceptions can change, but when we did this work in August, there really was this confidence in their position as a country that could make a difference, especially in the war in Ukraine. That was really similar with the USA, but also had this slight bent of the USA really helping the world's economies get back and moving again. So really the sense of confidence in the influence that they have in these new global challenges. The countries that felt like they didn't have as much momentum were often frustrated with their government's COVID-19 response or slowed down by this sort of perceived threat of new world events. So one of the big pieces out of this was that China didn't necessarily feel like they had the same momentum that they did in the past 2 years. the sense that they still have a really strong sense of influence, but it is the first time that I've heard Chinese consumers in these groups talk about not necessarily believing in that zero COVID-19 goal was the way to go. But overall, the sense that the CCP was a government that protects human life, so they were really still quite happy with what was happening, but they were starting to question whether it was the right thing to do and what the economy might take from that. The likes of Germany were feeling really connected to those around them, and that was due to war being on their doorstep, sort of solidifying Europe, but also the sense that they are really quite uncertain when it comes to how that might affect them as consumers. As we're going through right to the end, through to Japan, there was the sense that they were in quite a precarious position, not only because of the war, but an economy that hadn't opened up as quickly as others. So they were starting to question what their place was in the world, and what being careful started to look like for them in the future. So when we put them all on a page, what we see is that the COVID-19 response each one of the markets had, combined with these new geopolitical challenges, affected the momentum that each country now carries. So if we're dealing on the left-hand side with countries that might be sort of wary of their place in the world, we need to be really cautious of what that looks like in their context. So we need to show that we're eager to work with them, but also how might this help some of those larger geopolitical forces at play that are having a more negative effect on them. For China, they will be looking to, for global understanding as they sort of work through these lockdowns that they've got. But we also need to be really prepared for China when the borders open, because they're a consumer that has got a lot of desire to get out and experience things outside their own borders. For the UK and the USA, we need to show them that we are ready and moving on too, as they start to open up and feel that little bit more confident. And when it comes to Singapore and Dubai, because they're already so confident in the way in which they've tackled COVID-19, the way they're moving forward, we really need to start with what's in it for them and how that might come to life. So the implication there is really don't expect your market to be the same as where you left it. We need to be calibrating messages to match the new challenges that they face as they go forward. And so that's the first two sections. I'll pause there for questions or comments if anyone has anything that you'd like us to answer. You're on mute. Sorry, David.
Some of those questions into the, please plug in your questions into the chat. We've got nearly 300 people on the call at the moment, so hopefully get a few questions from you. And I'll bring in also Jane and Halon too. So that first section there is almost a bit of a teaser, really. It's like showing about what the world's thinking of themselves, what are they thinking of their environment. Picking up a couple of questions in the chat. This will be recorded. This is being recorded, and we'll make this available on our website. So for those of you who have to duck off or anything, we also this is qualitative research, isn't it, Alex? So it sits as part of a kind of a panel of research where you go and have focus groups, but against the backdrop of a lot of quantitative research that we already do. So we do, as Ian did story, we do a lot of work quarterly with understanding global perceptions at many thousands of people. This allows us to get much more micro into the mindsets of those people who respond.
Yeah, that's great.
I've got a first question for you. Of course, the last 3 years has been completely chaotic, and I guess we were naive if we thought that was going to change now. The world is still very disrupted, not just COVID, but now war and other, macro factors. Do you think that these perceptions are likely to remain stable in the next 12 to 24 months, Alex, or are we going to just continue to see changing perceptions of the reality that people are in?
I think the perceptions that each country has of themselves are going to continue to be in this unsettled mode. So like I pointed out, the UK particularly, that is a market where they were feeling really confident about where they're at and their place in the world. But I'd like to hazard a guess that might be slightly different now with some of the sort of changes they've been having within their government and other sort of spaces. So I think in terms of, you'll see this as we go through the perceptions of New Zealand, I think some of them might stay stable as we move forward into next year. So I'm really confident that those will stay strong for the next sort of 12 months. But when it comes to countries' perceptions of themselves, they are likely to change as sort of things happen. This unsettledness really does lead to changing country perceptions.
Yeah. Now we've got Halon who's living in LA. He's the Trade Commissioner for New Zealand for that region. Halon, obviously you're living in a foreign country. Does this sort of perception that Alex outlined there, you're seeing this in real time?
Yeah, I think that's accurate, David. And I'm just seeing some other questions come through which say that it really depends on the specific sector that you're focused on. And I think that's really true. We've seen a lot of variability between the different industries. For example, if I compared the consumer goods sector with the say beauty sector, what's happened in one is completely different to what's happened in the other. And I think a lot of the advice to our New Zealand companies has been make sure you're not necessarily focusing on the averages that are coming through in the data, and really honing in on the sector and consumer that you're targeting.
That's right, and that sort of answers this question here from Camilla about different sector impacts, and we will have later in this presentation, but also in the pack, I think, in the Alex, dig in by sector, and there is links back. There's some data that we've done quantitatively that you can also download from the NZ Story website. Jane, and you're obviously representing the Greater China region, although you're based here in New Zealand, but you have a huge connection back. Again, does this ring true from what you're hearing from colleagues and friends and family?
Yes, absolutely. I think the biggest challenge for China, obviously, is the uncertainties around association with the zero COVID control. So people do understand it's about to strike the balance between the economic growth and the COVID protection, eventually safeguard people's life. But people and companies in the market are showing great resilience. They are trying hard to be compliant with the COVID control measures to cope with sporadic local lockdown, but also trying to operate a business as much normal as possible, such as managing the logistic challenges and cope with the travel disruption on a daily basis. These are all become part of the new strange normal, as Alex previously mentioned. Obviously, people do have concern on the near-term economic prospect. And I think, what does it mean for our companies? Like many of the other countries, New Zealand has largely put COVID behind us. But given the circumstance in China, I think it is all about willingness to show the understanding, to show your empathy, to show monarchy, and particularly for those who have local team members or you have a business partners in the market.
Yeah. Thank you. Just to pick up a couple of other questions, we didn't do research in India. Our research is in those 10 countries. It's a very expensive thing to do lots and lots of research in lots of countries, but that's something we'll take on board for future. Sian has asked about the current economic impacts for these markets. Does this drive them to being local and focus on, buy local versus imported? And is this a factor we need to be aware of? I mean, Alex, maybe this comes out later in the presentation.
Yeah, I will mention it specifically in the food and beverage space, but what we have found is it hasn't necessarily been the consumer wanting to buy local as much as their options have become more limited. So they have been choosing local, and in some instances finding out that it isn't necessarily any different when it comes to the actual tangible benefits that they might experience with the product. So especially hearing that in the likes of China, when it comes to milk from each place, they can get used to a local offering, which is a little bit of a challenge for us.
Can be a challenge, yeah. Right, let's keep going with Alex, if that's all right. We'll get into the meat of the deck, because this is where we start to talk about what the perceptions are of New Zealand from consumers and business. So, this is really insightful as well. So we'll remove ourselves and hand back to you, Alex.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks very much. So as David said, this is the meat of the presentation, because this is where we deep dive into New Zealand's global perception, how that shifted in 2022. So what we found that in 2021, we heard a lot about us as a people and how we tackled COVID-19 with care, how we solved problems differently to the rest of the world. But what we found in 2022 is that the pendulum is swinging back towards what we have and this focus on nature. So the dominant narrative really now is about our natural beauty. So to give you a bit of a context, this was quite a surprise to us. So in 2020 and 2021, when we started to talk to consumers about New Zealand, the first thing that would come out of their mouths was about our COVID-19 response and what that meant for us, what that meant in comparison to their own country, and what that meant about us as a people. So that was a really strong message that came through the last 2 years. But when we started to have a conversation with consumers this year, it had gone back to almost 2019 or sort of pre-COVID levels, where the first thing they'd talk about is our beautiful natural spaces, our landscapes, what we have. Not so much Lord of the Rings anymore, but generally the sense that we've got an amazing place, more so than we are an amazing people. However, there has been some perceptions that have remained from our COVID-19 approach. So we often hear about our zero case milestone, our care-based approach, and our decisive independence. But what we now hear more about is the fact that because consumers have had some time and the beauty of hindsight, they don't necessarily see those in as positive a light as they used to. So if you think about that zero case milestone, yes, it might mean that we sort of cleared cases quickly and presented a united front, but it also came to represent something that might have held us back and made us slower to reopen. Similar to the care-based approach, was there an opportunity that we missed out on because of our overly cautious, in their words, approach to COVID-19? When it came to decisive independence, there was also this question around, well, yes, they did do their own thing and did things differently to the rest of the world, but was there a level of individual freedoms that were given up as a consequence of that? So generally what we find is that the positive perceptions that we had facing COVID-19 had been weakened slightly by both this change of focus back to nature, as well as the sense of hindsight, what they believed was the correct way to tackle COVID-19, even though if you'd asked them at the time, they wouldn't have known. And they did feel really positive at the time. This sort of sense of hindsight has dulled some of the positives that we were hearing. Another thing that came through really strongly was the sense of Māori culture continuing to resonate and is amplified by that approach to COVID-19. So across the Western markets that we spoke with, there was this really strong awareness of our Indigenous relationships and the strengthening view that we're a country of two cultures learning to live side by side. And that when they think about our COVID-19 response and our response to Māori Pākehā relations, there really does seem to be this sort of common theme when it comes to the sort of care-based approach that we do take. So for Western audiences, a lot of the time this is in comparison to their own First Nation people. And for markets sort of like Dubai, Japan, China, there's almost this respect of us bringing traditions through into the modern world. So whilst there is a real focus on it in Western markets, it's still coming through really strongly in Eastern markets as well. So when we do think about Māori culture, it is linking us to this growing association with care, respect, and inclusiveness that does accelerate consideration for us as a country. So some really positive moves here from a global audience. So what we do when we talk to consumers in these focus groups is we get them to write down different words or phrases or things that they really associate with New Zealand. And when we looked at all those words in bulk, it started to really reinforce the step back to nature and landscapes and this emerging challenge that we have with expensive. So whilst we are more sort of natural, we're all more about landscapes, more about beauty. We've never heard the word expensive mentioned so many times in this piece of work. So it always came up in 2020 and 2021, but it's now almost a dominant narrative when it comes to consumers thinking about New Zealand. So whether that's flying to us or buying products or engaging with us in any way, we're being seen as more expensive than before. Some of the positives that have come through from the COVID-19 period haven't necessarily gone away, but there's just more competition for some of these messages than ever before. So some of the things that have stayed consistent, which are really positive around humanity, care, agriculture, inclusiveness, respectful, peaceful, positive, are still really coming to the fore. But it's going to be harder than ever to start to talk to some of these narratives when there's more dominant things happening above them there. And we need to really start to look to strengthen our country brand in ways that talk to some of these consistent themes, as well as work through some of the dominant or emerging themes as well. So what we did as we went through this process was map the different responses through each year. And in 2020, we found that our COVID-19 response resulted in this really strong positive attribution that further strengthened in 2021, but then softened in 2022. So when consumers were thinking about progressive and modern, honest and integral, welcoming and inclusive, strong, decisive, human, safe and protected, we were seen as getting really strong with those in 2021, but that is really starting to fall away in 2022. So we need to be careful that our sort of sense of being a progressive nation of idea makers has taken a step back. We need to ensure that we are more than just beautiful landscapes by starting to really work to some of these 2020 thoughts and positive attributions that were coming through from different countries. Some of the watch-outs that we're seeing in 2021 were the strengthening of our shadows. So similarly, in 2020, we heard words like isolated, unfamiliar, closed, unprepared, far, rural, and quiet. whilst they strengthened in 2021, they really strengthened again in 2022, and they're starting to become entrenched in the mind of the global consumer. So we do need to show the world that we're closer and easier to work with than they think. It's really key here, that word easier. When we start to talk about New Zealand products, traveling to New Zealand, living in New Zealand, it always feels really hard. So whenever we can start to message easy or just as easy as, or something that isn't necessarily out of their way, I think we need to start to counter some of these negative trends that come through around being difficult to work with or difficult to engage with. So with the perceptions that each of these different markets had about themselves, we got them to go through that process when it came to New Zealand as well. So each one of the different markets that we conducted this work in were talking about us having less momentum than we generated in our 2020 response compared to themselves. So the sense that we're feeling smaller, we're feeling further away, and we're feeling quieter than ever before. So when it came to influence, the sense that we were able to make statements through our actions during the COVID-19 period, but now that there are different crises, whether that's cost of living or war or climate events, that we may have a sort of limited ability to influence some of those larger new emerging challenges. Secondly, we're feeling further away, so the sense of connection to the world is actually starting to look quite negative. So the sense that our geography helped us a lot in COVID-19, but now it's making us, or holding us back from being front of mind. So the sense that with everything being more expensive with that shipping, as well as not being able to get on shelves, just means that everything that we offer has become more expensive or harder to access. So whether that's flying here, there's not as many connecting flights, or buying products, it's harder than ever before. There's also the sense that because we did close ourselves off from the world, we did lose that sense of connection as well, or we haven't opened up as quickly as others. Thirdly, we do feel quieter as well. So this has been one of the changes that that we were most surprised by as a group. So the sense that in 2021 we heard a lot about people wanting to move to New Zealand because it was idyllic, because it was perfect, and there are all these amazing things happening there, and I could move there and it would be amazing. Now, what we hear is that I could move to New Zealand and it would be like moving to the country. Maybe my life would be a bit slower, but I might miss out on a few opportunities along the way. So maybe it's more of a later in life thing than for those who are in their prime. So this assumption that we're not necessarily a place that people can go to strive for success is starting to pull us back off what was a really positive attribute that we had in 2020 and 2021. So what we've found is that COVID-19 as a process has helped us punch above our weight, because we had the world's eyes on a single issue, and New Zealand solved that single issue really, really well. But now that these global measures of success have widened, we're not necessarily perceived to be able to make the same impact across what's now important, and therefore we feel smaller, further away, and quieter than we have in the last 2 years. So what that means is that we need to really find and dial up what's inherently New Zealand in your brand story to start to maximize the impact with your global audience. So whether that's finding a little bit more nature in your story and dialing that up at the start to get people engaged, to move them through into some of those other core messages that you want to tell, or whether it's sort of really honing in on some of the latent things that have stayed with us through that COVID-19 period. It's really important to actually find what your story is within that, and see how it starts to pitch and change based on some of these insights that we're hearing, or some of the changes that are coming through. As we went through this process, we also heard from different business customers that had all dealt with New Zealand in some way, shape, or form. And what we found is we broke these insights into 3 different areas. The first of which was really around the global business environment. What we found is that it's more tighter and more conservative than ever before. So almost the first thing that came out of people's mouths when we were talking to them about what good looks like in 2022 and 2023 is really about delivering on time and in full. So no longer are there excuses to miss shipments. There's a sense that most markets have caught up, and there aren't any excuses to not being on the shelves anymore. The sense that we need to double down on our efforts to catch up with the world, and that just starts with staying in stock all around the world. Secondly is that return on investment runways have become shorter. The sense that investors were looking to invest, but they were really starting to focus on those that had fully formed ideas or signs that the business was tracking to ROI positive. The sense that This might be more of an opportunity for us than it is other markets, because we tend not to shout out about our successes too early. The sense that if there's a product that's proven but hasn't yet scaled that you know of, now is the time to sell it in, because investors are looking for more evidence before they start to get their wallets out. Thirdly is the sense that we need to blend face-to-face with online. So what the pandemic has done that's been really positive for us is open up a number of our customers to having more online meetings, but they told us that face-to-face meetings are still really important to show that you're dedicated to the relationship and that you want to work together and that you really are committed to them. So we can't be too complacent with video calls. Maybe we're being in touch more often, but we still need to be fronting up to show that we're serious, because the rest of the world has already started. So we need to be cautious of that. In 2022, we've seen these new pressures on their end consumers as well. So it starts with cost of living. So that needs to, one of the biggest challenges that we heard from that business community was really starting to find and prove value. And that was really critical for them. So not always about being cheaper, but almost about sort of showing why our story is worth telling and why we are something that they should be investing in. It's really good for us because we actually have a really strong story. So number 5, when you think about New Zealand's story and a country that has a set of values that are really consistent, that comes through really strongly with the consumers that we were speaking with, because there is this general sense that the consumers that both we spoke with and that we heard about through the business interviews that we conducted was the sense that they were looking to experience more, and they wanted to know the value, and they wanted to know a little bit more around the story and the backstory. So we do have a leg up there versus some less defined markets. And then 6th was the environmental considerations are stronger than they have been in the past. So the sense that consumers want to know that they're making a better choice, and we have a real natural advantage there. So generally people think about New Zealand and they think what we make and create is sustainable, but there's this growing niche of people who do want to start to see some of the facts that come with that. And we need to start to provide them, or else we'll lose that halo that we do have, or that assumption that we do have that we are an environmental choice. Lastly, when it comes to that business environment, we do need to focus on winning back lost ground, because there was this general sense that New Zealand hadn't started up in the business community as fast as others. So the sense that we are starting from behind. So whether that's physical or mental availability, it has slipped in both spaces. So that's both the relationships that we have with people in market, but also influences within the market as well. So we heard a lot, especially in the Chinese market, about KOLs who have a really long wait list when it comes to promoting products to their to their circles of influence. So we need to be careful about sort of building back all those relationships that we have with the end consumer, with influencers, and with our business partners in market. So we all need to work harder than ever to make an impact in each one of these spaces. There's this general sense, what we hear from buyers, that New Zealand could work together more and have more of an impact. So the sense that we are a small country of small businesses, we do need to work together on that world stage to make a rising tide lift all ships, essentially. So buyers' recommendations to us that we needed to share that a little bit more, that sense, whether that was a booth at a trade show, whether that was itineraries with the same consumer, or a container. So the sense that how could we work with others around us to make us all succeed. 9th is to be remotely accessible. And this came through really strongly from the tech sector, that there was a question that was asked around why isn't New Zealand the leader in remote working? Why don't we have that title on the world stage? Because there is a distance barrier to working with us, but how can we show that because we are so used to working remotely and we have proficiency in it, that distance is no longer a barrier anymore. So there's an opportunity there for us to work harder on that remotely accessible piece. So what this means to you is that there needs to be a greater need to show eagerness in meetings to overcome some of these mental and physical hurdles COVID-19 has created. So that's those 2 sections there. Any other questions when it comes to our changing perceptions or some of the things that we heard from the B2B markets?
I'm muted again. I keep forgetting to unmute myself. Good opportunity for those of you who are watching to put some questions in, and I want to bring back in Halon and Jane, because obviously that perspective is quite confronting. It's different. It's a view of New Zealand where the world is not has moved on a little bit, and maybe we're resetting back to where we were in the past. Halon and Jane, maybe Halon first. Does this ring true for you? Is this starting what you're perceiving in the interactions you have in the business space in the US?
A little bit. I mean, maybe I'll just touch on the comment around expensive. That was the one that was in the largest font text. So I think a couple of things here. One is that obviously the people that we talk to through this survey, they already have a connection with New Zealand. And anybody that's been sitting at home for the last 2 years looking at flights down to New Zealand are going to see some pretty hefty price tags. Any New Zealand visitors that they've welcomed into their homes or their businesses recently, since New Zealand's opened up, probably having similar conversations about how expensive people are feeling that things are. So that's come through practically in the survey, which is fine. But to answer the question itself, I actually think it's a good thing. We've always been expensive or been commanding a premium. The key is tying in why we're expensive to that perception through the brand story. New Zealand products are generally looking at that premium through quality, traceability, sustainability, kaitiakitanga, taste, whatever it might be. The key is, I think, to embrace it. Retailers themselves aren't necessarily going to shy away because you're more expensive, especially if you're getting sell-through in the product and if you're looking to work some marketing with that retailer. If they're able to shift the consumer from a $2 toothpaste or $4 toothpaste, that's a big win for them. Similarly, if they're able to expand the category that you might be selling into, those are all positives. So overall, my comment would be that price matters less than having price matters less than having a point of difference that has you standing out from the competition.
Yeah, and that sort of goes a little bit to this question that Mark's asking here about expensive may mean exclusive. I mean, New Zealand's default kind of pricing strategy can't be that we compete on price. It doesn't work as a country. We don't have the volume to be able to do that. So in some ways, while we're not going out there wanting to be the most expensive, it's an exclusivity thing.
Yeah, there was a real change between what expensive felt like in 2021 versus 2022. So we just wanted to call out that it is increasing and it's becoming more of a narrative. So we need to counter that with our value story and why we are more expensive, but why it's also worth it.
Yeah. Jane, what about you? Does this research around business, does it
interesting on the expensiveness? Yeah. If you look at the data, right, for the last 12 months, the vast majority of New Zealand food export to China has continued on the growth despite of being more expensive. And so we had to constantly relay our value story. Of course, food and beverage could be slightly different message to the other sectors. For food and beverage, sometimes we say the remoteness of New Zealand geographically help to minimize the exposure of New Zealand product to potential contaminants or pollution. So this is how we focus on food safety, freshness, nutrition, and we also focus on a sustainable farming practice and also products made with great care. We're not in a rush to longer time. And these are attributes that really resonate with the Chinese consumers. I always want to touch on the wine story because New Zealand wine's average export price per liter is the highest in China compared with those imported from other major wine countries. Wow. So 2 weeks ago, New Zealand has been awarded International Wine Region of the Year in 2022 on the Tmall Alibaba platform, which is a great recognition on New Zealand brand and a great story we tell about the premium.
That's interesting. I mean, yeah, you're right. Sometimes it's about creating that level of exclusivity that comes with it and aspiration, perhaps. But there, some good comments here coming through. I'll just pop up a few. It's important to have a balance between the source of origin, the national values, and the value. These things are all components, but what you just said, Jane, that consumers will think about. Someone's asking. You made the comment, Alex, about New Zealand, I suppose working remotely is one of our things that we've managed to work out how to do. Do we have any great examples? I'm not sure if you do or if Halon or Jane might know of any great examples there.
I've got an example of where it might not work so well. So we were talking with somebody who was in the tech space who said there are a number of New Zealand companies with one or two people who are in Denver or in Colorado, and they didn't necessarily seem to be working as one because there was a New Zealand office and a USA office, and they almost worked in little silos rather than just being the whole remote office all working together. So it'd be interesting to see if there were some examples from the NZTE team on where that's worked before.
It's a challenging one, Alex. In some ways, traveling to market and actually having your feet on the ground, and just walking the supermarket aisles, visiting your distributors, going to see factories and warehouses. There's nothing that can beat that. And particularly your comment there around the disconnect sometimes between your remote teams in the United States and the New Zealand team. That's something that our teams need to work, our businesses need to work really, really hard on. And it really is sector dependent, right? If you're looking at something in industrial technologies, then after sales support is going to be very important to the American consumer and the partner that you're looking to work with. On the other hand, it might be a consumer goods product, and their buyers have taken a lot of the efficiencies that they've gained through COVID, such as receiving samples and having interactions over Zoom, and continued that on to this present day. So it really depends. Things like focus groups, getting market intelligence, getting feedback on your product, a lot of that stuff can be done remotely with the right service partner in the United States. So it really is on the specifics of what you're looking to do in the market.
Nice. Good question potentially for you, Jane. Sustainability credentials, are these seen as an area that give us some sort of competitive advantage?
Oh, absolutely. Sustainability has been one of the hot topic in China and pushed really hard by the government, and the awareness has definitely been raised. For example, Chinese government made huge efforts on the waste sorting and the recycling over the recent years. But while most Chinese consumers agree sustainability issues are important, and they tend to be influenced by companies who provide a sustainable approach on their brand or products, but sometimes how to turn these influence into purchase driver is another question, isn't it? Particularly during this difficult time when things get more expensive.
It is. All right, another good question here from Jack. On this issue of being small or siloed, have we had feedback or seen examples of structures where small businesses are able to collaborate and partner for scale? That might go to the kind of work that NZT does around coalitions and things like that. Which maybe Halon, do you want to comment on?
Sure. I mean, I just make a comment for the US market, and here you're able to find a niche of whatever size for whatever scale that you're potentially looking to target. The key is being really clear on what that niche is. So, for example, instead of looking at trying to target a Walmart or a Whole Foods, you might be looking at more of the Ma and Pa stores through a B2B platform such as Fair. It's just getting your strategy correct from the outset and being very realistic around what you're able to afford and achieve in the US. Too often we're finding companies are stretched too thin and not being realistic about the goals that are they're able to obtain here. The US is not a market where you can go in for an opportunistic short-term win. It's a long haul and it's expensive. And if you're realistic about that from the outset and your business plan covers that, then you're generally more likely to be successful.
Yeah. Jane, another question. Again, I'll go to you first here. The safety narrative. I mean, obviously through COVID, people became more aware of food safety. Is this concern something that we're still seeing going through in the China market in particular?
That's a good question, because if you're looking at the safety, probably a lot of people, as someone touched on about buying domestically, right? So particularly for food and beverage products, a lot of Chinese consumers tend to go local. And one of the reasons is there's some fear about the COVID trace left on the packaging of the product, particularly
literally as in when it's been touched.
Yeah, exactly. So that put a lot of people off. Sometimes for fresh and frozen product, they tend to go for local. Yeah, so food safety is definitely one of the key areas that people really care.
Yeah. This is a long question, but I'll summarize. Basically, the question here, and there's a few of them. This is an example of a question. Is it a time now where New Zealand needs to be more conscious in our marketing? Basically, for the last 2 or 3 years, perhaps we haven't invested in trade marketing or direct-to-consumer marketing. Maybe what we're seeing now is the result of a lack of investment in marketing? What's your comments there on that one, Jane?
I'll just give a quick go. I think New Zealand does really well on building up the country branding. So that's across all the markets, particularly for China. And I think what companies need to dial up is the value proposition of their own brand. And it's not about just we position ourselves as premium. It's about what's the unique value proposition of your product, of your brand that resonates with the Chinese people, and what actually matters to individual. It's not just about this product is great. It's what matters, whether it's a science-based, scientific approved evidence to be very helpful for your health. There are some health benefits. So it needs to be matters to individual. And I agree. New Zealand needs to do a lot of investment on this area.
Yeah. Another question around the same lines here about this. So, Halon, what are your thoughts? Do we need to do more on trade shows, premium marketing? What's the answer to getting the brands out there for your individual products and companies?
I think a lot of it, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, a lot of it comes down to the product that you're looking to sell. But what I would say is that you can't overinvest in understanding the customer persona that you're selling into. And there's obviously a lot that's changed over the last couple of years, particularly with digital marketing and the social media platforms. And we're now seeing obviously the rise of platforms like TikTok being of much more interest to brands because of the authenticity that content platform plays. So my answer here is that it really is just more about doing more homework and being really clear on who you're looking to target, looking at more A/B testing, looking at what works for you, and looking to partner with your partners or retailers wherever you possibly can.
Yeah. And there's a question that I'm going to pick up here because someone's asking, how do we reconcile this differentiation that we need to do with marketing with the New Zealand story that we talk about, talking about being from New Zealand. And I think it goes to a few things. One is, Halon's comment about there are opportunities in niches, and New Zealand's default export strategy is to sell premium into niches. That is basically the overarching kind of export approach that we have to take as a country. And we know that there's enormous value in the brand of New Zealand. I mentioned earlier, $440 billion is the estimate that was done on the value of New Zealand, which is more than McDonald's, just as an example. And so you get a halo effect of being from New Zealand. You can still differentiate within that, of course, but when a consumer picks up a brand and sees that it's from New Zealand, it connotes a whole lot of information, of trustworthiness, of innovation, of freshness. Some of the things that are almost indicated in the research there about this exclusivity, etc., come through from that. So, we always would recommend, particularly in the food and beverage space and nutraceuticals and those sorts of consumer products, that brand of New Zealand is such a valuable asset that you should absolutely lean into it. Absolutely. Alex, do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things that we really try and do when going into these groups is to understand with each one of the different sectors exactly what that story is at a really high level. So there will be niches within each one of those different sectors, but if we go in and try to understand what the general story is at a high level, that then enables each one of you to then dig a little bit deeper to see how that might influence your niche rather than necessarily taking it as rote. So one of the things we should be focused on.
Beautiful segue to us to go into the final chapter of our 3-chapter story, which is sectors. And I'll just remove Jane and Halon again, and we'll bring them back at the end for final Q&A. But Alex, we also looked at this through the lens of sectors. So maybe take us through that.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. So one of the things that, as David said, we also did this through different sectors. And how we did this is we got consumers to think about what has changed within their lives in each one of these sectors and what the things that they are now hearing about around New Zealand are starting to think about when it comes to New Zealand. And there's a lot on each one of these slides, so I won't go through them in too much detail, but what we have done is almost taken a rip out or a one-page rip out for anyone who's in the food and beverage space to just have a deeper look at this when it comes to the wider pack. So what we found is we do a little bit of comparison to where we have been and where we are now, and that's similar when it comes to the insights itself. So when it came to food and beverage, we were losing desirability in this world of rising costs. But now what we're seeing in 2022 is this increase in focus on our nature and what we have has meant that our products have increased this perception of naturalness as well. But alongside that increase of naturalness has also come with a significant rise of costs. So some of the things that we're hearing that have stayed consistent from 2021 is just this preference around sort of cooking rather than buying. Means that they can have an experience at home that almost mimics going out and experiencing new and different areas through international cuisines. But once again, prices are increasing. So price increases have been a really strong focus as we've gone through this as a whole, but it's really front of mind now for these consumers. The new things that are starting to come through was the sense that Western markets were really starting to be much more aware of food miles than they have been in previous research. And as a country that is by default far away, we need to have a story around why we're different and what our carbon offset story starts to look like. But there's also this general sort of tension between what the global consumer can afford, what is actually available, and then what they desire. So we need to be sure that we're really starting to lean into that what they desire space. We need to be growing that sense of desire. So if we're not necessarily available or a little bit more expensive than the competition, then we've got a story there. So our challenge really for food and beverage in 2022 is how we start to develop the specialness story in a way in which consumers can start to bring that into their everyday and turn that niche or that once in a while to all the time and start to bring it into their habits. When it came to primary industries in 2021, we couldn't afford to be a commodity, but now we represent the sense of trust and responsible production in the face of mistrusting bigger providers. So that's something that came through really strongly in this piece of work was this growing distrust in big corporates, whether that was around hormones or additives or the way in which the production was happening, whether that's the human costs or the environmental costs. And there was this increased awareness of sector issues. So we need to be thinking about how we can start to make a stand in those places. Some of the challenges that have remained are the sense that we have poor visibility in mainstream channels and the sense that we are now no longer the only natural and fresh option. So this is where some of those insights come to the fore that I was talking about before around consumers having less options, so had chosen local where they may not have before. And we really need to start to counter that narrative, especially in different areas where those differences aren't necessarily tangible or easily understood. So we need to talk about the way in which we're softer, we're better, we make things with more care without necessarily consumers being able to see some of those differences all the time. When it came to immigration in 2021, we were out of the consideration set because they weren't able to travel to us or to move to New Zealand at all. But in 2022, there was a sense that moving to New Zealand and getting a visa was very, very difficult and not necessarily worth the drop in, worth the cost of living that they would experience when they were in New Zealand itself. So the sense of what stayed the same is that it's really difficult. You have to persist through a lot of barriers if you do want to move to New Zealand. But also the positive being that this sort of sense of laid back, green, natural is really helping us be a destination that has a work-life balance that people really appreciate. So some of the things that are coming through as new and in some ways are a bit of a red flag in terms of monarchy, really that when it's so difficult to get a visa in New Zealand or there's little hope of getting a work visa, some were questioning whether we were actually back open, whether our reluctance to welcome people back to work here was a sense that we didn't actually want to open up at all. The sense that I've talked about this before again, but moving to New Zealand moving to a place that doesn't have that same sense of success is a really big factor as well. So the sense that even our big cities are lacking opportunities, and it's something that we need to be comparing ourselves to San Francisco or Sydney and starting to think about what our story is around succeeding here in New Zealand. So we need to really be showing them that we're a place where they can get ahead, and that whilst there are some challenges to moving here, it is worthwhile for the work-life balance and the opportunities that present themselves here. When it came to education, last year was this real sense of pent-up demand that students wanted to experience the world again, but they wanted this pathway to success afterwards because they were a little bit worried about their place in the world. And in 2022, we've found all that pent-up demand has gone to easier and more exciting options that were available sooner than us. So generally the sense that students were looking for a whole lifestyle or a whole experience that we work really well with. The fact that there's a lot of things to do outside of university, and paired with that is this positive that we're safe and inclusive. But some of the challenges that are now coming to the fore, once again, are around cost of living. So how can we show that whilst moving or living here has become more expensive, there's different ways in which to start to manage some of those costs, whether that's not living or going to university in main centres or something similar, or package deals for accommodation and fees or something similar. So this still comes through, and because we are talking about parents and their kids as well as students, there was a sense that parents were worried that if there was a new strain of COVID-19, would lock their kids away and they wouldn't be able to see them again for a period of time. So we need to really start building up that idea that we're a life-enhancing study location with more to offer than just the learning itself. So some real challenges there that we heard around the perception of education in New Zealand. When it came to tourism, what we heard last year was this growing sense of wanting to stay as local as possible, just in case. But now what we're hearing is that there's this real desire to go beyond just ticking destinations off a bucket list, but wanting to connect emotionally with the people and the place that tourists were visiting. So we're still really hard and far away from most markets, except for Australia, where they've got this real growing appreciation for us. But what we're finding that's different is the sense that travellers are more focused on their spend, where it goes, and looking for experiences that have this greater sense of emotional connection, whether that's hearing the story about a place or the people or having a local interaction. But there's also this growing interest in sustainability. I thought this was quite funny from a consumer, that they're not worried about sharing a helicopter if they have to, from a more sort of premium end. But generally the sense that they're looking for, or they're more comfortable to be asked to do their bit. What we do find, because nature is coming to the fore more than before, now is probably not the time to reimagine our boundaries when it comes to starting with nature, when it comes to a New Zealand experience. But there is an opportunity to remind them that we have more to offer than our landscapes. So whether that's wineries or food and beverage experiences, how can we start to weave in some of those other sectors through tourism? And the sense that easy and safe has increased in importance, and us countering that closed narrative has never been more important. The fact that they will be able to get out if COVID-19 re-emerges. So the sense that we need to focus on is being seen as worth it as a country when environment and cost pressures are such a factor when it comes to where they choose to go and what they choose to do. When it came to tech and investment, in 2021 we saw this burgeoning legitimate choice for startups, but now we're seeing is more legitimate than ever, and almost something that you shouldn't be hiding when it comes to being in that tech and investment sector. So especially that comes from our approach to COVID-19 piquing interest in us as a market, and that's specifically with investors. So we heard from those in market or in the sector itself that if you're getting 50 emails a day of very similar pitches, then being from New Zealand does stand out, and it does get you further down into the process when it comes to that investment pipeline. We also heard there's this real desire for tech talent to look outside of Silicon Valley as a place for places to live and work, in the sense that remote working has made distance less of a barrier. But some of the challenges that we are hearing is that it's not really that clear when it comes to how they could work from New Zealand, even if it was for 3 months. What might that look like? And are we even interested? So we heard from one person in the investment space around the fact that she gets a lot of messages from sort of Eastern European countries and Switzerland about working from the market for 3 months in a remote role, and what that might mean for them. Despite the fact she was really focused on New Zealand, she'd never heard any messages from us in that space. So something that we could necessarily focus on there. I've said this before, that sense of investing in a sure thing has been really important and comes through really strongly, but what the world's actually expecting from us at the moment, not necessarily seeing, is that sort of climate technology and sustainable design space. There was a sense that we may not be taking up that opportunity as much as we could. Seems to them to be a sort of winning opportunity for New Zealand as a market. So the sense that we need to leverage further value from the interest that's been piqued from COVID-19, and we need to start to build all these examples as to why we can solve the world's problems in a unique way, not just COVID-19. So those are each of the sectors, and what I'm going to leave you with today is just 6 takeouts that we took from this work in 2022. So generally, when we're thinking about COVID-19, what we're hearing from consumers, what we've found is that New Zealand performs really well when the focus is tight, and our response allows us to flex our soft power. So if there's anything at all that COVID-19 has taught us, it's this power of focusing on one thing. And what might that look like if New Zealand does decide, whether that's as a sector or as a set of competitors, to all start to talk about one thing, the power of that and starting to cut through. Secondly, is that we really do need to start to combat expensive by talking to value and start to counter some of these cost and availability challenges that we currently experience. And I've talked through these before, but it's worth waiting on these exporter imperatives that we saw from this work. Firstly, is to message back to all that will build confidence by showing we've moved on. Secondly, that we need to really find and dial up what's inherently New Zealand in our brand stories to maximize this impact that we have with the global audience. But we can't expect our markets to be the same as where we left them. We need to start to calibrate these messages to match these new challenges, and that there's greater need to show eagerness in meetings to overcome the mental and physical hurdles COVID-19 has created. And that's the pack as it stands. So interested once again to hear any questions or comments. Found it was a really interesting process this year in terms of the changes that we did see. It wasn't necessarily just all about our COVID response this time. We'd almost gone back to some of those associations from 2019. So there are some positives and there are some challenges that we can take from that. But yeah, interested to hear what you all thought and whether there's any other questions that you might have.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you, Alex. Really insightful, sobering, perhaps. That data is so important and insightful and very different by sector. It's what Halen said earlier a couple of times is, you really have to get into the detail of this by market and by sector to understand where we play. There's one question I'll pop up first. Maybe this is a good one for Jane first. Any sense of whether Aotearoa is considered sufficiently multicultural for global citizens? How are we perceived as a country? Are we perceived as a multicultural country or a monochromatic?
Obviously, China view New Zealand as a respect of Indigenous, and Maori culture was very well perceived in China, and particularly during the last few years, there's a lot of exposure about Maori culture in the market. We've got a range of New Zealand Maori companies actively in the market. Yeah, but obviously there can be more we can do in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting, Halen, you deal with across multi-sectors, being the trade commissioner there. You have tech companies, you also have food and beverage and beauty, etc. Does those sector sort of views ring true to you? They're quite different perspectives based on sector.
Yeah, that's right. There's a whole bunch of variation across sector, David, and it was the same throughout the last 2 years with COVID as well. We're finding that some sectors, trade shows plowed on like nothing had happened. Others that are only just starting to come back now. So I know we keep talking about this, but it really does depend on the views of that sector and what's been seen as the norm through COVID as to how you're engaging with those sectors.
Yeah. Jane, if you had to pick the biggest issues, I suppose, that New Zealand companies face going into China, right now, what would they be?
Well, I guess the biggest issue is the travel restriction and uncertainty on the movement in terms of the quarantine time on arrival, which is 7+3, and also uncertainty around ad hoc localized lockdown. So when you get to China, you might have restriction from moving one place to another city, depending on the case numbers, etc. So manage your travel schedule could be a bit challenging. So we always ask companies to build plenty of flexibility in your travel schedule. And the other thing I could think of is in China's domestic made products are catching up really quickly in terms of the improved quality, increased varieties, and innovative features. So, and some of them are great in telling the brand story, tell the value story as well. So they can also respond really quickly to the market demand and the consumer needs. So for New Zealand companies, now we are facing not only the competition from international brands, but also domestic made Chinese brands. Again, as I probably touched on before, we can't simply rely on New Zealand country branding and claim to be premium. We really need to articulate these value propositions, either through a sustainable design, or you say it's a science-based evidence, or it's innovation feature.
And Halen, what about you? What do you think the biggest issues are that New Zealand companies need to think about?
Well, the obvious one is just the rate of inflation, right? I think this week the Fed's looking to increase for the 6th time in a row the interest rates in the US, and we're not going to beat the Fed. So that's going to start to hurt everybody. I think there's been a lot of commentary on that. The second one, which I'll spend a bit more time on, is what I'm describing as uncertainty and confusion. There's a lot of different data points out there at the moment that aren't necessarily reconciling, and I feel like the US is in for a very interesting time over the next 4 weeks as we go into this holiday spending cycle, and just how much money consumers are willing to pull out of their pocket for the Christmas and Thanksgiving spend. You couple that to some of the issues that we're still seeing come through COVID, which is retailers have enormous inventory levels and the potential for them to be dumping stock. There's a lot of retailer optimism. I think still over 75% of retailers are expecting increased sales this year, yet we know consumers are looking to spend less. We've got this decreasing disposable income. We've got a significant increase in the cost of living for the average American home, yet we've still got 1.3 trillion of savings through COVID. So just how this whole picture, when you overlay all the macro challenges that the world's dealing with that are impacting the United States, it's going to be a really interesting time. So I think a lot of our companies are trying to unpick that and understand what that means for them, and at the same time, obviously trying to minimize their inventory exposure and cash flows and whatnot. So yeah, watch this space.
Yeah, and then of course we've got the New Zealand dollar, which is bouncing around as well. So there's lots of dynamics for exporters. That question there about retail, you mentioned it just then, Halen. Anything about insights there that you've got coming up into that holiday season?
Yeah, well, this is clothing's a really interesting one, right? Because it's one of those ones that was impacted quite heavily through COVID. People not necessarily going into the office. It was one of the areas that may not have got the degree of focus or spend that it did pre-pandemic. And so, just what does that look like now coming out of COVID? There's just thinking about things like the e-commerce channels are looking at augmented reality for people now trying on shoes and clothing products. How are they looking to compete with the retailers? It's clearly one of the segments where people are more willing to go into store to purchase. So there's a whole bunch happening in that space, which I think is again going to be one of these really interesting categories to watch over the next 4 weeks.
Yeah. Right, we're nearly finished. We've got some great comments just coming through. I think everyone's pretty happy. Great takeaways there. Good insights to work with. I like this one. Thank you very much for Joseph. Just a year here after living in India and UK. Great, thank you. Let's end on a high. It's still a great place to live, work, and play. Any final questions or final comments from you, Jane, before we finish it up?
Quickly comment on, from the economy-wise, in the short run, a lot of people have concern about the near-term economic prospect. But medium and the long term, people still feel stay positive. If we look at the data for the last quarter, the GDP growth in China has reached the 3.9% instead of the 0.4% in second quarter. So there's already indication that the economy is starting to pick up.
That's great. That's an optimistic thing. What about you, Helen? Any final words of advice?
Yeah, similarly. Even though people are talking about the storm clouds on the horizon, there is still a lot of money in this country. There's a lot of opportunity. You just need to be super clear on who your end consumer is and how you're going to target them and how you position yourself in this market.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both for being part of this. Just so everyone out there knows, we obviously had 10 markets, I think it was in this survey, but we couldn't have 10 people on the call. So thanks to Jane for representing Greater China and Halen for the USA, two of New Zealand's biggest trading partners. Alex, any final thoughts from you?
No, that was it really. I think once again a really interesting way to start to check the changing perceptions of what's happening. So Like I said throughout the pack, we didn't expect there to be such a big shift back to nature and back to some of the perceptions we were seeing in 2019. So I do believe there are going to need to be some changing stories when it comes to what we're telling the rest of the world to make the most of that, but to also reinforce some of the things, some of the positives that came out of that approach from 2020 and 2021.
I wanted to also just finish by talking a little bit about the Fernmark program. So this is one of the things that New Zealand Story does on behalf of New Zealand, is we license the trademark silver fern there in the corner. So if you're an exporting business and you want to associate yourself with the brand of New Zealand, this is a great way to do it. We license that through for you to put on products or in your marketing material, that sort of thing. We currently have nearly 500 companies, actually. A lot of them are in the food and beverage space, but more and more in the technology space. Alex mentioned earlier, actually, that New Zealand's tech and innovation, if you like, reputation globally is only increasing. So lots of opportunity to associate yourself with that brand of New Zealand through using the Fernmark. And, it's used in over 30 jurisdictions, millions and millions of products and companies. So a great way if you do want to really start to think about strategically how you use the value of that brand of New Zealand. I'll skip past these. Now, last thing I wanted to mention is if you're an exporter or a company out there thinking about, how can I get some more help? I wanted to pull out these three things. First of all, our colleagues at NZTE have done a fantastic tool specifically around the Australia market. It's called How to Show Up in Australia. Really detailed work on how in-market execution can work, and it's an online tool. My NZTE is another online tool that NZTE operates. It's a treasure trove of information about different markets. If you Google My NZTE, and I think you can access that Australia tool via that, you'll find a lot of guidance there. And then lastly, Go Global. For those of you who are exporting companies, if you're not going to this event, our partners at Export New Zealand run this annual event for exporters, Go Global. Well worth going along to and hearing, from other exporters who've trodden the same path. So 3 great ways to get some practical help. And of course, the New Zealand Story Toolkit's always there for as well. And I thought we'd finish now and say thank you to everyone here for being part of it. Thank you to Halon and Jane and Alex. And we'll finish with this video, which we recently released for Aotearoa New Zealand, Our Story. Kia ora koutou katoa.
Welcome to the country that cares, where our ancestors navigated the ocean to seek new lands. It's a land where our history unites us. Welcome to Aotearoa, New Zealand, the country forged by ingenuity.
Wow.
Welcome to a land that cares for us, because we care for her. Welcome to a country that continues to innovate with care. Where ancient wisdom has taught us, what is the most important thing in the world? It is people, it is people, it is people. Welcome to the country where the landscape connects with you. Where we stand on ancient glaciers and golden beaches. Welcome to a country whose cities are alive. Welcome to a country where learning is embraced. And our manuhiri Our visitors are welcomed. Partnerships are trusted.
And memories are never forgotten. Nau mai ki Aotearoa New Tireni.
Welcome to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Together, we can do amazing things.